The late afternoon sun blazed high and relentless over the dry, cracked earth of the New Mexico territory. Dust swirled in lazy eddies along the rocky trail where Jed Cassidy rode, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds with each tired step. He'd been wandering this arid land for weeks, a drifter chasing rumors of work or trouble, or maybe just the freedom that came with having no ties. The desert wind tugged at the brim of his battered Stetson, and the scent of sagebrush hung heavy in the air. Jed was a lean man in his early 30s, with weather-beaten skin, eyes the color of storm clouds, and a steady hand that rarely trembled. His leather vest and worn boots told stories of long rides and hard days under the sun, while the Colt revolver resting at his hip spoke of a man ready for trouble but hoping it wouldn't find him today. He was making his way toward the faint shimmer of a creek rumored to run just beyond a ridge, hoping to refill his canteen before nightfall. Water was precious out here, life or death, depending on your luck and grit. As he crested the rocky rise, the sound of low, pained groaning caught his attention. Jed's hand instinctively hovered near his gun, but the groans were human, soft and desperate. He slid from his horse, eyes scanning the scrub brush near the creek's edge. There, half hidden by the shadows of cottonwoods, lay a young Apache girl, her clothes torn, face streaked with dirt and blood. She was no older than 17, thin as a sapling but with eyes fierce and wide, shining with pain and wary suspicion. A deep gash marred her upper arm, blood dried around the edges, and her breathing came in ragged gasps. She was alone, wounded, and vulnerable. Jed's first thought was caution. Apache lands were dangerous for a white man, especially one wandering alone. But the girl's suffering cut through his usual reserve like a whip crack. He pulled his canteen free and moved slowly toward her. "Easy now," he said in a low, steady voice, holding out the canteen. "You need water." The girl's eyes flickered with a mixture of hope and distrust. After a tense moment, she nodded slightly. Jed tipped the canteen, letting cool water spill into her cracked lips. She drank greedily, the life returning to her pale cheeks. "I ain't here to hurt you," Jed said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Name's Jed Cassidy." She didn't answer, but her gaze softened just a fraction. Jed reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a clean cloth, dampening it with more water. Carefully, he pressed it to her arm, cleaning the wound as best he could. "Why are you out here alone?" he asked quietly. Her eyes darkened with pain and something else, fear or sorrow, maybe both. Then, in broken English, she whispered, "Fighting. Men come. My people. Run." Jed understood enough. The Apache and settlers had been clashing for years now. Blood spilled over land and pride. But this girl, this was different. She wasn't just caught in the crossfire. She'd been hunted. Night was falling fast, and Jed knew he couldn't just leave her here. There were no guarantees that Apache warriors wouldn't see him as a threat for helping her, or that settlers wouldn't come looking for trouble if they found her. With him. Still, he didn't have the heart to abandon her. "You can ride with me, if you want. I know a safer place ahead." She hesitated, then nodded. Together, they made their way back to Jed's horse. The girl's strength was weak, but she clung to him, trusting in this stranger who'd given her water and care. As they rode toward the fading light, Jed's mind churned with questions. Who was she? What danger chased her? And what in the hell had he just gotten himself into by stopping to give water to a wounded Apache girl? He didn't know yet, but one thing was certain: his life was about to change forever. The moon hung low and silver over the vast desert as Jed rode cautiously, the wounded girl leaning weakly against his side. The night was cooler now, the kind of sharp chill that bites through thin clothing and makes a man grateful for a fire. Jed had tied the girl's arm as best he could, using a strip torn from his own shirt, and the wound was no longer bleeding but still raw. She hadn't spoken much since they left the creek, only glancing up at Jed with dark eyes filled with a quiet, almost unyielding strength. He respected that. She was scared, sure, but stubborn as a mule, and that grit was probably what had kept her alive so far. They'd ridden about half a mile when she finally broke the silence. "You give water," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough. "In my tribe, that means, you are now mine." Jed blinked, pulling back slightly in surprise. "What? You save life, you marry," she said again, slower, as if teaching him a hard lesson. "Apache law." Jed frowned, trying to wrap his mind around what she meant. He'd heard stories before, old customs, things white men didn't understand, but this was new. "Now, don't go gettin' all jumpy," Jed said, forcing a half smile. "You're hurt, and I helped you. That's it. No law gonna make me your husband." The girl's eyes darkened with seriousness. "Law is old, strong, binding. You cannot run." Jed exhaled slowly, the desert night still around them like a living thing. He knew better than most how customs could be ironclad in some places. On the frontier, a man's word, a promise, a gesture, those were as good as gold, and breaking them could mean a bullet or a blade in the back. "Well then," he said, shaking his head, "I guess I better figure out what this means." The girl nodded, her gaze flickering toward the ridge ahead. "Come, you meet my people, they decide." Jed's gut twisted with a mix of uncertainty and something else, curiosity. Maybe. What kind of people followed laws like this? What kind of place did they call home? He tightened his grip on the reins and urged his horse forward. The girl, whose name he still didn't know, leaned closer, the quiet between them now filled with an uneasy alliance. As the first light of dawn painted the sky with streaks of orange and purple, they approached a narrow canyon rimmed with tall pines and the faint sound of drums beating in the distance. Jed's heart thudded. This was Apache land, no doubt about it. "Where's your camp?" he asked gently. The girl pointed to a small valley hidden from the main trail. "There." They dismounted cautiously, and Jed led the horse down the rocky slope. The girl moved with surprising agility, despite her wound, guiding him through a maze of trees until the trees opened onto a clearing. There, a cluster of tipis stood against the backdrop of rugged mesas, smoke curling from small fires. Several figures stepped forward, men and women dressed in traditional garb, feathers and beads catching the morning light. Their faces were painted with red and black markings, eyes sharp and watchful. Jed felt their gaze like knives. An outsider, a white man with a gun and no business in these parts. But beside him, the girl stood tall, despite her injury. An older man, tall and stern, with streaks of gray in his hair, stepped forward. "Who are you?" His voice was low, steady, demanding respect. Jed tipped his hat slightly. "Name's Jed Cassidy. I found your daughter hurt by the creek and gave her water. That's why I'm here." The man's eyes narrowed. "You know the law." Jed nodded slowly. "I've heard." The girl stepped forward, her voice strong despite the lingering pain. "I say he is mine. By law, he must stay." The council members murmured among themselves, some nodding, others frowning. The older man studied Jed carefully. "If you accept this, you become part of our people. Your heart, your loyalty, will be tested." Jed felt the weight of the moment pressing down. He wasn't sure if he was ready to be tied to this world he barely understood. But walking away now wasn't an option. "No one's forcing me," Jed said quietly. "But I'll stay and see this through." The girl smiled faintly, the first genuine warmth Jed had seen from her. That morning, under the wide sky of the untamed West, a strange bond was forged, one born of survival, law, and an ancient tradition that would change the course of both their lives. The days that followed the trial's end were quieter, but no less charged with meaning. Jed Cassidy felt the invisible thread of connection tighten between himself and the Apache people, but most of all, with Mika, what had started as a forced bond by law was slowly transforming into something more real, something neither of them could yet fully name. The camp settled into its rhythm beneath the vast western sky. Jed worked alongside the tribe, learning their ways, how to track the elusive deer across rocky slopes, how to read the language of the wind, how to move silently through the brush without disturbing a single leaf. Mika's presence was constant, her steady guidance a quiet comfort as she taught him the songs and stories that stitched their people's history into the land itself. Jed watched her closely. She was fierce and proud, yet there were moments, rare and brief, when the weight of survival softened her gaze. She laughed easily around the fire with her cousins and friends. But with him, her smiles were quieter, more guarded, as if testing the waters of trust. One evening, the sun dipping low behind the mesas painted the world in golden shadows. Jed sat beside Mika near the riverbank. The sound of flowing water was a balm, and the camp's bustle felt distant. "You don't have to pretend with me," Jed said softly, tossing a smooth stone into the river. Mika looked at him, eyes reflecting the fading light. "Pretend?" He nodded. "I mean, you don't have to be so strong all the time. You're allowed to be tired, scared." She hesitated, then sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing. "It is not weakness, it is survival." Jed smiled. "Maybe, but even the strongest need a hand to hold sometimes." Her eyes searched his for a long moment before she reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair behind his ear. "You have changed, not just because of the law, because you fight with us, live with us. And you're teaching me what it means to belong." Their fingers touched, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. In that quiet moment beside the river, something unspoken passed between them, a promise, perhaps, or the first spark of love. But the West was never kind to such promises. Word came that a group of settlers had pushed further into Apache territory, ignoring warnings and tearing up sacred land for their own greed. The tribe was restless, ready to defend what was theirs. And Jed knew the fragile peace could shatter with the slightest spark. One night, as stars dotted the sky like pinpricks of hope, Jed and Mika stood together watching the distant ridge where dust clouds marked the settlers' camp. "We may have won the last fight," Jed said, "but this ain't over." Mika's jaw tightened. "Then we stand together, like we always have." Jed looked at her not just as the girl he'd found wounded by the creek, but as the woman who had become his anchor in a land that tested every soul. "We'll face it all," he said quietly, "together." As the fire crackled and the night deepened, the bond between them solidified, forged in the heat of hardship, tempered by respect and growing affection on the wild, unforgiving West, where loyalties were tested and hearts hardened. Jed Cassidy had found something worth fighting for, and a partner who would stand by his side through every trial yet to come. The first light of dawn barely cut through the thick haze of dust and smoke hanging over the Apache village. The air was heavy with tension, the calm before a storm that Jed Cassidy could feel deep in his bones. The settlers' encroachment wasn't just a rumor anymore, it was a threat bearing down on them like a freight train. Jed stood at the edge of the camp, gripping his rifle tight, the weight of his Colt at his side a familiar comfort. Around him, the Apache warriors readied themselves. Faces painted with war colors, thread streaks, black mark symbols of protection and defiance. Mika stood beside him, fierce and unyielding, her eyes locked on the horizon where the settlers had made their camp. "They're coming," she said, voice low but steady. Jed nodded, feeling a hard knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't just a fight for land, it was a fight for survival, for honor, for the very soul of this place he'd come to call home. The village elders had called for a council at dawn, but the answer was clear. There was no room left for words. The settlers advanced, a rough band of men and a few guns, dragging wagons loaded with supplies, their greed visible in every hurried step. They didn't understand the land, the people who called it sacred, or the price they'd pay for trespassing. As the first shots rang out, Jed dropped low behind a rocky outcrop. Bullets zipped past, kicking up dirt and shards of stone. Around him, Apache warriors returned fire with expert precision, arrows flying silently through the air, deadly and true. Mika moved with a dancer's grace, her bow drawn, eyes sharp as a hawk's. Jed covered her flank, exchanging fire with a settler who crept too close. The man's shot grazed Yet's shoulder, burning but not crippling. The fight was brutal and raw, the kind of battle where every second stretched into eternity, and the line between life and death blurred like smoke on the wind. Jed could feel the tribe's heartbeat in the chaos, their will to defend their home, their families, their way of life. Hours passed in a blur of gunfire and shouted commands, the sun climbing high before finally beginning its slow descent. The settlers, battered and bloodied, started to falter. At last, with a rallying cry from Dakota, the Apache warriors pushed forward, driving the invaders back beyond the ridge. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Jed looked around, heart pounding. The village was scarred, some lost, but unbroken. He spotted Mika tending to a wounded warrior, her hands steady and sure despite the exhaustion in her eyes. He approached her, lowering his rifle. "We did it." She glanced up, offering a tired smile. "Because we stood together." Jed reached out, taking her hand in his. The fight had tested everything, their strength, their courage, and their bond. But through it all, Jed knew he belonged here now, not just by law or trial, but by choice. As the sun dipped behind the mesas, painting the sky in fiery reds and golds, Jed Cassidy stood with his people ready to face whatever the Wild West threw their way. Because some battles were more than just survival, they were the price of belonging. Ready for the final chapter. Part 7. New Horizons. You said : yes, ChatGPT said. Here's Part 7. New Horizons, wrapping up the story with hope, change, and the start of a new life for Jed and Mika. Part 7. New Horizons. The first light of morning spilled softly across the Apache village, casting long shadows over the earth still marked by the scars of battle. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and sage, but beneath the weariness was a quiet strength, the promise of renewal. Jed Cassidy stood near the edge of the camp, watching the sunrise over the mesas. His shoulder throbbed from the wound, but that ache was small compared to the weight that had lifted from his soul. He breathed deep, tasting the crisp desert air that now felt like home. Beside him, Mika moved with steady grace, her eyes bright despite the hard days behind them. The village was alive again, children laughing, warriors mending their gear, women weaving and tending fires. Life, stubborn and unyielding, pressed forward. "You changed," Mika said softly, breaking the silence. Jed turned to her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "So did you?" They'd both faced their trials, not just the battle with settlers, but the harder fight of trust and understanding between two worlds. The tribe had accepted him as one of their own, but more than that, they had woven him into the fabric of their lives. He was husband, protector, and partner to Mika, bond forged not only by law but by choice. Tokoda approached, his stern face softened by a rare smile. "You have walked the hard path, Jed Cassidy. Your place here is earned, and your heart belongs to the land and people." Jed tipped his hat in respect. "I'm here to stay." Mika reached for his hand, her touch warm and steady. "Together, we'll face what comes next." The days ahead promised no easy road. The West was still wild, and dangers lingered on every horizon. But with Mika by his side and the tribe behind him, Jed felt ready to meet whatever storms brewed beyond the mesas. He'd come into this land a lone drifter, a man with no name and no ties. Now, he was part of a story far bigger than himself. Story of survival, honor, and belonging. As the sun climbed higher, painting the world gold, Jed and Mika rode out together, their silhouettes strong against the endless sky. The frontier stretched before them, untamed, wild, and full of promise. And for the first time in a long time, Jed Cassidy knew exactly where he belonged. The sun was high and hot when Jed Cassidy finally stepped fully into the heart of Apache land, a place both wild and ancient, carved out by generations who knew the meaning of survival and respect for the earth beneath their feet. The village was small but vibrant. Tipis clustered near a winding creek, smoke rising from cooking fires, and the low hum of voices weaving through the dry air. Around the edges of the camp, warriors leaned against trees, eyes sharp and wary, watching Jed like a hawk circles prey. Jed felt the weight of their stares, a reminder that he was no friend here. Not yet, at least. He wasn't sure how he'd been drawn so deep into this world, but there was no turning back now. The girl Mika, he learned her name, walked beside him with a quiet confidence, though the shadow of her injury lingered in every careful step she took. Mika's people moved with a rhythm Jed couldn't yet fully understand. The women carried bundles of herbs and pottery, tending to children or weaving leather under the shade of cottonwoods. The men, tall and sinewy, kept their hands near their weapons, their faces marked with paint and expression. Jed watched, fascinated and cautious. This wasn't just a tribe, it was a living history. A culture fiercely proud of its roots and unyielding to the encroaching tides of settlers and soldiers beyond the mesas. An elder woman approached, her hair streaked with gray but her eyes sharp and kind. "You've helped her," the woman said, nodding to Mika. "You carry honor, outsider." Jed tipped his hat, offering a rare smile. "I try." Mika's uncle, a broad-shouldered man named Tokoda, stepped forward, his gaze like steel. "It is one thing to give water. It is another to live by our laws. You must prove your heart." Jed nodded. "I don't plan on running." The tension between the Apache warriors and Jed eased a fraction, but the message was clear. Trust was earned, not given. That afternoon, the council convened beneath a giant cottonwood, its leaves whispering ancient secrets in the breeze. The tribal leaders gathered, their voices low and measured, speaking in Apache before turning to Jed through Mika's translations. "You are bound by the law," Tokoda said. "But to remain, you must show respect not only to the girl, but to our people, our ways. You will learn. You will walk among us as one who honors our land." Jed swallowed hard. This wasn't just about helping one wounded girl. This was about becoming part of something larger than himself, a connection forged through hardship and tradition. Mika watched him closely, her expression guarded but hopeful. Jed could see the flicker of uncertainty behind her brave eyes. She'd saved him from the desert, and now, in some strange way, they were bound together by more than just fate. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Jed sat near the fire with Mika and a few of the young warriors. They shared stories half in Apache, half in broken English about battles fought, the spirits that roamed the land, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Jed felt the unfamiliar stirrings of belonging, a feeling foreign and yet oddly comforting. The Apache had a way of living that was hard and pure, no place for lies or weakness. That night, lying under a blanket of stars, Jed thought about the long road ahead. If he was going to honor the law Mika spoke of, he would have to change, not just his ways, but his heart. Because out here, in the wild and endless West, survival wasn't just about bullets or brawn. It was about respect, loyalty, and the courage to stand for something bigger than yourself. And Jed Cassidy, a man who had once roamed alone, was about to discover just how far that could take him. The dawn broke over the Apache camp with a crimson glow, spilling light across the rugged mesas and casting long shadows over the earth. Jed Cassidy stood before the tribal council, his hands resting lightly on the worn leather of his belt. The weight of many eyes bore down on him, young warriors, elders, and the fierce gaze of Mika, whose presence grounded him. Tokoda, the tribe's elder warrior, stepped forward. His face was carved with lines of battle and wisdom, eyes sharp as a hawk's. Jed Cassidy, you stand here not just as a man who gave water, but as one who claims honor in our ways. To stay among us, you must prove your heart. The trials begin. Jed nodded. I'm ready. The first trial was one of skill and courage, a test of marksmanship and steadiness. Jed had always been a crack shot, but this was different. The targets weren't paper or tin cans, they were carved wooden symbols of Apache spirits. Perched high in the branches of an ancient juniper, Jed's fingers tightened around the grip of his Colt. The desert wind whispered warnings. But he took a deep breath, steadying his aim. One by one, he fired. The gunshots cracked sharp, echoing against the mesas. His bullets found their marks, each one splitting the wood with satisfying precision. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd, but skill with a gun was only the beginning. Next came a test of endurance. Jed was sent out alone into the unforgiving desert with little more than his knife and a canteen. Tasked with finding a rare herb used by the tribe's healers, the sun was merciless, the land a dry furnace, but Jed pushed on, driven by the knowledge that failure meant rejection and possibly death. After hours, under the scorching sky, sweat burning his eyes and throat parched beyond reason, Jed found the plant growing stubbornly near a dry riverbed. He carefully harvested the leaves and returned to the camp as the sun began to dip. The tribe's healer, a wizened woman named Nasha, inspected the herb and nodded in approval. You have the eye of the land, she said softly. This means respect. But the hardest trial was yet to come. The council gathered again beneath the cottonwood. Tokoda's voice was grave. Now comes the trial of the heart. You must walk among us, live our ways, and show your loyalty not with words, but with deeds. Jed was assigned tasks that tested more than his strength. He helped mend broken fences, carried water, and learned the quiet language of the people. Mika stayed close, guiding him through customs and ceremonies. One evening, as the camp settled around the fire, a band of settlers riding hard appeared on the ridge. They were rough men, eyes wild with greed, looking to claim the Apache lands for their own. The tribe prepared for defense, and Jed found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with warriors he'd barely begun to understand. The test was no longer one of ritual, it was real, fierce, and immediate, with gunfire ripping through the night and arrows streaking like deadly shadows. Jed's mettle was forged in the flames of battle. He fought not as an outsider but as a defender of a people who had taken him in. When dawn broke over the smoldering ground, the settlers were driven off, their greed beaten back by a unity forged in blood and courage. Tokoda approached Jed, his face unreadable. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke. You have proven your heart, Jed Cassidy, not by law alone, but by honor. You are one of us now. Mika smiled, her eyes bright with something like hope and promise. Jed felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd come into this world a stranger, but through trials and fire, he'd earned a place here, not just as her husband, by law, but as a man bound by respect and loyalty. The frontier was wild, lawless in many ways, but here, in the heart of Apache land, Jed found something rare: belonging.